If you're on the other side of the United States in geopolitical terms, I think when you see Trump implementing these policies, you should probably be gratified because, I mean, he's damaging America's position in the world. He's, I mean, hurting other countries, but he's hurting, I think, America most of all.
Hello, Mr. Ronald. Hello, guest.
Hi, Professor Shi. I'm very glad to hear, very honored to be on, your show and talking with you
My great
about the
pleasure.
important issues. I think the notion of simply a ceasefire without a longer term peace agreement is obviously something that the Russians would find unacceptable because there have been a whole series of individual temporary peace agreements which really never went anywhere. Minsk I, Minsk II. For example, the Russians were persuaded to pull back from Kiev very early in the invasion on the grounds that there was about to be a settlement agreed to, and it never came about. So, in other words, I think the way the Russians handled it was Putin's response was very deft. In other words, he didn't reject the notion of a ceasefire agreement, he accepted it. But he said, well, we have to go through all the details of the possible ceasefire agreement, what it involves. And in a sense, given all those details he raised, I think the likelihood of a simple ceasefire agreement being implemented is almost nil. In other words, Putin, in a sense, rejected the proposal, but rejected the proposal in a very deft way to make it seem that he'd accepted it. What the Russians want, obviously, is a much broader peace agreement that involves a neutralized Ukraine, a demilitarized Ukraine, and the sort of agreement that they'd come very close to getting just a few weeks after after the war started. So it seems to me the Russians are handling things very effectively. And I certainly hope there is a peace agreement. And it all really comes down to whether the American government is willing to implement a peace agreement of the sort that Trump had promised when he was running for office.
Yes, in my point of views, just you mentioned, it's a proposal. And that means what we really need is kind of agreement with very sophisticated and concrete steps, which can push the situation moving toward the status named the ceasefire. But according to the IR series, according to those analysis on why the war started and how this war ended, we will find today the ceasefire proposal raised by United States is kind of impossible triangles, which means it's including several points which cannot be achieved together. Point one is kind of ceasefire. Point two is they want the Russia to accept it without condition that the battlefield situation actually Russia is taking great advantages. The United States did not have enough tools, frankly speaking, to pressure Russia to accept the ceasefires and abandon the battlefield advantages, which means de facto such kind of ceasefire, especially a temporary ceasefire, will become nothing but kind of time windows for the Ukraine side to rearm itself with the military aid from the Western, and that definitely will leading to the final breaking of the temporary ceasefire by the Ukraine side if they believe they are prepared enough again and have enough confidence and the resources which they needed to fighting back Russia on this battlefield to ensure finally this battlefield status will become advantageous for the Ukraine side rather than the Russian side. And finally, the last point is no matter what kind of content and ways that Trump's side raised the ceasefire proposal, the one of the most important goals of this proposal is to ensure that the United States will become the final winners, at least in the US domestic politics. That means even though Washington will put great pressures on Kiev's side, the Trump administrations cannot accept the final result that make people believe such kind of ceasefire or even agreement means a total surrender to Moscow from the Washington side. It means it will providing the Kiev leaders enough confidence he can fighting against any pressures from the Washington side if he believes such kind of ceasefire or peaceful agreement will means a total surrender to Russian side. So even the United States can use very tough policy tools like cutting off the intelligence sharing and temporarily halted military aid to the Kiev side. The US cannot just do nothing and waiting the Kiev side being totally defeated on the battlefield. That make those proposals are very tough jobs for the Trump administration's foreign teams to sell to both Kyiv side and the Moscow side. So today, what we see is there's a so-called ceasefire proposal raised by the Washington, and the Washington tried to push it to accept it by both Ukraine side and the Russian side, but both sides use different tacticals de facto rejected these peaceful proposals. So nowadays, I think it's kind of stalemate on this ceasefire negotiation process. There's a lot of terms on the negotiation tables. Moscow did not send in a very clear reject, but it's a kind of de facto reject. From the Kyiv side, after the meeting in Washington, Zelensky definitely changing its diplomatic and negotiation policies toward Washington. He used very softened terms, but he actually modified the conditions and the terms raised by Washington on these ceasefire proposals, adding a lot of conditions, including asking the Moscow side to return so-called of the children from the Ukraine field after the conflict begin, which means a nearly mission impossible for Moscow to accept these conditions. He used a very soft but very decisive reject to this peaceful proposal. So in future, I'm also quite curious how Washington can push forward the so-called ceasefire on this battlefield without changing its first priority goals. That means just stop this conflict as soon as possible so that United States can definitely stop providing military aiding, which become more and more tough burdens for Washington in today's period. And also, Trump can say that it got a very important diplomatic winnings by during this process. I think it's a very tough challenges for Trump's teams, and just to wait and see how this situation will develop in future.
I would strongly agree with that. I mean, the whole point is that on the battlefield, the Ukrainians have been defeated. In other words, the war is lost. Russia has, in effect, won the war. They're moving forward. Their, military strength is growing. The Ukrainians are being basically defeated. They, they've lost nearly their entire pocket in Kursk. And so it's a very strange thing. When a war is being fought, the losing side cannot say we'd suddenly like a ceasefire to rearm, to re-equip, to strengthen ourselves. I mean, in other words, it's not the sort of thing that actually would happen. There's no reason for the Russians to agree to it. The only reason I think the Russians were willing to, in effect, soften the rejection they made by saying that they accepted it subject to all these other conditions is they do want to reestablish normal relations with the United States. In other words, they're hoping that Donald Trump will be willing to reestablish regular relations with Russia. And so, to the extent that they don't want to alienate Donald Trump, they were willing to, in effect, go along with this proposal, but in a way that, amounted really to a soft rejection. For example, one thing I heard is Trump had sent his envoy, Witkoff, a New York billionaire, to meet with the Russians on this. And supposedly he was kept waiting for 3 hours. In other words, basically, as a sign of the Russian dissatisfaction with the American proposal. I mean, the American envoy was basically kept cooling his heels for 3 hours, which is, not the sort of thing you do when you're indicating you're happy with what's going on. I mean, the problem is that Donald Trump had run for the presidency, promising that he would be able to end the war very quickly, almost immediately. And there's no sign of that really happening. In other words, basically, the Russians are certainly not willing to concede to his proposal. They're not willing to allow a militarized Ukraine to remain in place, to be rearmed, and to restart the war in a year or 5 years' time. And so, for that reason, I think the Russians will still keep on moving forward on the battlefield until the Americans force the Ukrainians to agree to what the original Russian terms had been. In other words, a demilitarized, neutralized Ukraine that will not ever become part of NATO. I mean, that's basically what the Russians have been asking for from the beginning. And, in particular now, several of the oblasts of the provinces of the Ukraine have now been officially incorporated into Russia. And the Russians are certainly not going to return that territory. In fact, I would think that part of the agreement might require the Ukrainians to leave, to basically remove their forces from those portions of the remaining territories that they still control, which would obviously be a sign of Ukrainian defeat. So, I mean, the bottom line is the Russians have won the war, and I think the Ukrainians have lost the war. And I mean, there's no way that you can massage that reality through the sort of diplomacy that Trump is aiming for. So, I think basically it's a question of whether the Americans are willing to recognize the reality of what happened on the ground or not. And it's a difficult thing because I mean, you have an enormous sort of ideological infrastructure that's built up in America and the West on the notions of the Russians being weak, the Russians being easily defeated, the Russians losing the war. And it's hard to admit that that was all propaganda, dishonest propaganda from the beginning to the end. In other words, from everything I've heard, the Russian economy is doing really quite well, much better than anybody had expected. The Ukrainians are losing on the battlefield. And we've seen, for example, that the entire West is unable to produce military munitions of the sort that are needed in an ongoing war like this. In other words, Russia is basically outproducing nearly the entire West, which is ridiculous. So I just think I don't see, you know, these Trump proposals going anywhere unless Trump finally recognizes the reality of what's happened in the war, that the Russians have won, the Ukrainians have lost.
Yeah, I think that's just Mr. Ronald had mentioned. Frankly speaking, one of the most important characteristics of Trump's second terms is we finding a gap between the perceptions from peoples and the real performance of Trump's teams. When he win the election again, one of the most important prediction of his second team is people wish that this guy will become more matured, which means he grow up, got enough confidence, enough experience when he take this office for first terms, and then he will become more experienced to deal with those very complicated or sophisticated issues represented by Russia and Ukraine conflict. But the reality is, seeing that these guys, the only experience he got from his first team is he believed he understand everything. The only mistake for his first teams is he did not pick the right guys to realize, to deliver his own really ideas. He just find these people did not loyalty to him enough. And so he just pick a team. Its first priority is whether you are loyalty to Trump himself or his personal enough or not. Did not consider whether these guys are qualified for their positions. Did not consider too much on their real skills or experience to dealing with these sophisticated and complex things. The challenge here is Trump himself did not have a very proper or comprehensive training on IR relations or diplomatic knowledges or skills. He did not even have first-hand experience by doing diplomatic ways, which means you need patient, long-term goals, have a very detailed, pragmatic, passive designing skills to realize the goal. He just mentioned the goal. I wish I have a goals. I wish, in my understanding, these things can be solved in these ways. He didn't even have the so-called those sense of geopolitics, which means this guy refused to recognize that the issues like Ukraine-Russia conflict has a long history background, is very complicated. There's too many actors, they are interesting involved. They cannot act according to a very simple orders from Washington, from the White House. In short, he is not the only dominators of these games. He must consider other actors' requirement for their own interest and so on. So you'll find something, his behavior, how to say, you can say that this behavior is ridiculous, but sometimes you just find these guys, they are not got the sense. He don't have any sense. What he said when he said that I can finish or stop the conflict in the first 24 hours when he take the office in take the White House again. It's just like that he called Putin. Putin say, "Hey, you guys, welcome back. I will send you a gift. Let's stop these ceasefires." And he go call to the Kiev, say, "If you don't stop the fight, I will cut off this intelligence and military." So boom, you did and done everything just after these two calls. It's a very idealized scenarios, which is, frankly speaking, mission impossible in the real world. But the challenge here is Trump is too quickly to say his idea out without considering how to deliver these plans. And such kind of mission impossible proposals, he also providing a very high political reputations, like a gambling on it. So here comes the challenges. If he cannot deliver these proposals, he will losing face and got and disadvantages in US domestic political structures. But on the other side, if he insisted these proposals, he don't have enough or proper persons and the policy tools to deliver that proposals. Frankly speaking, in my point of views, if Trump want to launch this ceasefire, the experience from Nixon in Vietnam War is quite clear. At phase one, you should not cut off the aid to the Ukraine. You need to increasing your military aid to Ukraine and help Ukraine to rebuild the balance in the battlefield and raising the pressure to the Moscow so that Moscow will have the willing to sink these ceasefire considerations. But what he did is very different. In Munich, before he launched the negotiate with Russia, he just showed his every card. He said that this war you cannot win. We will not continue to invest from the Ukraine side. And that deliver a very clear signals to Russia side. If the Russia just keep moving on the battlefield and just wait, and finally, I will get everything we want. Frankly speaking, the second terms of Trump administrations, he still did not really learn any useful things from his first terms, and it's providing too much uncertainties, not only to United States, not only to the Russian-Ukraine conflict, but maybe to the whole world, not only on the geopolitical issues, but also on the comprehensive U.S. foreign policy framework will become filled with too much uncertainties in the coming 4 years.
I generally agree with that. In other words, the truth is Trump simply, doesn't have a solid understanding of these issues. And the problem is many of the people he's picked, for example, as defense secretary, Hespeth. I mean, basically, he was simply a talking head, a pundit on Fox News. And I mean, he doesn't have any experience. The Secretary of Defense right now is somebody who has no experience running a large organization. He doesn't really know any of these issues. And the same thing with many of the other people that he's brought in, like, even Marco Rubio, for example, or Secretary of State. I mean, Marco Rubio basically was a senator who focused heavily, for example, on Cuban policy, on some Latin American issues. And he doesn't really have the diplomatic experience that, for example, the foreign ministers of Russia or China or many other countries around the world have. So, I mean, again, it's really a government made up of people who don't have, I think, a good understanding of what's going on in the world and don't have a lot of experience. And in fact, people sometimes who do have a certain amount of experience, who do have a certain amount of knowledge, are simply blocked from holding any positions because, certain, foreign policy groups block them. For example, basically a former general, a commentator was picked by Tulsi Gabbard to be the briefer for the president of the morning. And he'd come out and criticized some of the ongoing slaughter of the Israelis in Gaza. And, once that came out, basically he was blocked from any appointment. So the problem is American foreign policy, or the American government in general, is under the control of a number of different powerful groups that can veto anybody who offends them on any given issue. And so, given all these sorts of vetoes, what you many times then get are the sort of people in place who don't really know what they're doing. And I mean, that certainly applies to Donald Trump. I mean, in fact, when you look at, for example, how he's gone back and forth in his public statements, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, he says one policy. Then 3 days later, he changes it. Then 3 days later, he changes it again. And I mean, that certainly doesn't give a lot of confidence either to our allies or to, for example, the countries who are considered our adversaries. And so, I mean, the American government is in a very disorganized state right now, which obviously is dangerous for the world. And, obviously, I think what we really should be doing is simply going for a peace agreement in Ukraine based on the terms as close as possible to what we could have gotten years ago with the Russians. In other words, a neutralized, demilitarized Ukraine that does not become part of NATO. That's what the Russians have demanded. That would be, I think, a reasonable solution to us, and it certainly would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives because this war wouldn't have broken out. So, I mean, I really think, the American government is simply entirely, it doesn't really know what it's doing on these issues. And the problem is many of these same foreign policy groups control both political parties in the United States. So, for example, in many ways, there's sometimes more of a continuity between Democrats and Republicans than the voters expect when they vote for the other side. And so I think, America is just in a very difficult position right now in foreign policy in these issues. And, I certainly hope we can get a peace agreement with the Russians over the Ukraine. And, we can certainly reestablish normal relations with Russia. But it's a difficult thing given that the Trump team doesn't seem to know what they're doing. I certainly agree with that. In other words, I mean, the whole thing is the tariffs that he's been talking about, the very large tariffs, I think would be disastrous for the American economy, harmful for the rest of the world, but certainly disastrous for the American economy. I mean, talking about imposing gigantic tariffs on Canada and Mexico, our two neighbors, and, generally countries that are quite friendly with us. I mean, it's just a ridiculous policy, and nobody in the past, I think, probably would have considered it. I mean, it's causing, for example, tremendous dislocations because, over the decades after NAFTA and after Trump's modification of NAFTA a few years ago, there's been a tremendous integration of the economies of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. For example, with regards to Canada, I mean, a lot of, for example, the auto companies are basically spread across the border. Their parts move back and forth. And suddenly to impose gigantic tariffs disrupts that part of the American industrial system. So, I mean, Trump doesn't really know what he's doing on those issues. And, I think it's very damaging to the United States. And, at first, since Trump was viewed as somebody who would deregulate, who would support business, there was a sense that businesses in America would benefit from Trump's election. But if you look at the stock market right now, it's suffered a serious decline. And if, for example, the Trump tariffs go into effect, and if they cause an increase in inflation, that obviously would have a tremendously negative effect on the American economy. And also, for example, it would stop the Federal Reserve from having any chance of lowering interest rates in the future. So, I mean, the result of these tariff policies, I think, will be potentially disasters for America. And, America is also alienating America's allies on this point. In other words, with the European countries, with Canada, with Mexico, with other countries around the world that we have good relations with. I mean, we're basically harming them and alienating them with these tariff policies. So, again, if you're on the other side of the United States in geopolitical terms, I think when you see Trump implementing these policies, you should probably be gratified because, I mean, he's damaging America's position in the world. He's, I mean, hurting other countries, but he's hurting, I think, America most of all. And I think it's simply because Trump and most of the people around him simply don't understand the economics of these issues. And I think I think the policies are very bad policies.
From China's side, as a research fund for the Sino-US relationship, the tariff issues maybe is the most frustrated issues make the research field because just like Ron say that it's completely wrong. It is policy. I never see that. I never think that I will make such kind of scenarios. Trump, just as a United States leaders, it seemed that he lived in the world mainly based on his own imaginations. It's not the real world. It's the world that he imagined. He believed the world is running like this way, but the real world is on this opposite side, on that way. And he has a very strong confidence on the effect of this tariff. But his understanding of this tariff effect and the running principles of this tariff, you cannot say it's completely wrong, but it's out of dated. It's the tariff work maybe sometimes in the 18th or 19th centuries, but not the year 2025. Most the more important part is Trump did everything in the name of MAGA, which means Make America Great Again. And this American Great Again means United States will stable or make safer of his positions as a hegemonic powers. But Trump did not understand, or it seemed that he did not have any real knowledge on how US hegemonic works. That's the most pathetic part of his policies, especially on these tariff things. His tariff tools, just like Ms. Ron said that, it's de facto defeating rather than make United States great again. It's defeating from inside of US hegemonic systems when he raises comprehensive tariff war to everybody in the world other than United States. That make a very interesting and nearly mission impossible scenarios will happen. Nowadays, nearly every country and regions got the threat from the United States tariff, take the same positions, they revenge. They launch a same tariff war to fighting against United States production exporting to them. If finally it become a reality, which means United States raise its tariff war to everyone, every other countries raise the same tariff war, retaliate United States tariff wars, then we have these scenarios. United States separate itself from the whole world trading systems by such kind of tariff gap. And all the other countries, if they don't fighting with tariff with each other, it means we will have a new world systems. All countries except United States, they're doing those free trades. And the United States market will replace by some other countries' domestic markets in the world. And the United States, what can United States got in these scenarios? United States will become from an open economy to a closed economy. The only market US production can ensure its domestic markets, and they cannot got enough advantages by either importing or exporting from other countries. That's like a rollback of United States from the 21st centuries to maybe 18th or 17th centuries. United States just isolated from the world and only depend on itself, producing everything and consume everything domestically. then United States will become isolated, either great or not great powers outside the world systems, and this world become a new world without US superpowers. Did that mean? I think that may be just the opposite side of the MAGA. It means that United States will completely retreat from the United States, from the world, and go back to the domestic or maybe the Western atmosphere to play with self. I think that no one can imagine they can realize such kind of goals from outside. But nowadays, a very active politician in the name of MAGA can realize this self-defeating of US hegemony. We cannot comment on that things. We just say that maybe that's the a kind of wisdom of history. The history just like the God looking from above say that, hey, you guys, this is your destiny. You made your own choice. You guys choose these people to become your president and let this president very confidently leading your countries to accelerate downside of so-called US hegemonic systems. Maybe after several years or several decades, those when history research today's world, they will feel it's like a joke of history, but it really happened. That thing. Also, people will worry that the only wish from outside, no matter how hard it is, it's your U.S. policy choice. It's your president to make that decisions. But the world wish that we will not suffer too much during that process. We want a very peaceful self-divide the United States front as of world, and then we can have a new balance, have a world without United States in certain ways. But I don't think that process will be stable. And also, I don't have enough confidence on Trump's. The most worried part is Trump's administration did not have enough skills to deliver any kind of proposals they want. Everything they give you are proposals, and their skill is so poor that they can make everything into finally a mess. And in that situations, very pathetic. No one can be really benefit from that situations. Only this guy, they can have enough confidence that I'm win. And the most impressed me is nowadays I cannot recognize the White House homepages. These White House homepages is just like Trump's personal pages, and everything is cherish these guys, like not the president, but the kind of empires. Hey, you guys, you're winning every day. Every sentence you're saying is kind of winning to you. So we are just providing you the joys.
I was going to say, I mean, I would very much second that perspective. In other words, I mean, what America is doing is basically walling itself away from the rest of the world. In other words, we're attacking on foreign policy grounds or on tariff economic grounds most of the other countries in the world simultaneously. I mean, basically, one of the few major assets America still controls is its control of the world financial system, the US dollar being the reserve currency. And the fact, for example, that at the beginning of the Ukraine war, America froze 300 billion in Russian assets, Russian dollar assets. I mean, it's just exactly the sort of thing that would make the rest of the world very nervous about keeping their financial reserves in the United States. And, there's actually talk right now, obviously, of basically seizing and converting the Russian assets, which, is not something that, normally happens in any sort of previous even world situation. So, again, with America taking all these tremendously self-defeating steps, it's really shocking how, there could be a rapid decline in American soft power, American influence, American economic control over the rest of the world. I mean, it's basically, again, if you have a leadership team running a country that doesn't know what they're doing and take steps that, are just entirely irrational, both in foreign policy and economic terms, I mean, the results could be very bad for the rest of the world, but even worse for the United States. And so, I certainly would second very much the point that the professor was making that, we really just have Trump and his leadership team who don't really know what they're doing on these issues and are taking very, very strongly self-defeating actions on these policies. I mean, again, when Trump came into office promising tariffs, I mean, there was a wide perception that he would target the tariffs against those countries he viewed as hostile to American interests. I mean, for example, American rivals. I mean, the notion of huge tariffs being imposed on Canada and Mexico, our closest and largest trading partners, were just something nobody would have expected. And again, the tariffs coming in and then going out again, being suspended, being reimposed. I mean, it's not the sort of thing that gives business investment any sort of confidence. And I mean, again, you have many countries around the world, the third world countries in particular, that are run by leadership groups that don't really know what they're doing. And to some extent, I think the American government right now has exactly that same sort of problem. And it's much more of a problem for the world if you have that sort of irrational, incompetent leadership team running one of the world's most powerful, important countries like the United States, rather than just, a small third world country. So, I mean, it's just a bad situation for everybody all around, but worst for really the United States on these points. Certainly a very dangerous political time in the United States. In other words, there's actually a lot of concern that, for example, a number of these Trump policies, even take, for example, the issue of tariffs. I mean, tariffs are supposed to be controlled by Congress. Congress passes tariff changes. The president does not have the right to implement tariffs, but using legislation, emergency actions, emergency executive orders, Trump is imposing these tariffs in a way that really isn't legally sound. I mean, the trouble is, over the last 10 or 20 years or 30 years, America's political system has become more and more fragile, more and more centralized in the presidency. So, for example, you have both Democrats and Republicans, with Trump being the most extreme example, implementing issues through executive order, which is not part of the constitutional system. A number of people have really pointed out on some of these policies, more domestic policies that Trump has tried to implement, Trump basically has been blocked by federal judges. And, a number of people have really raised the issue. What if Donald Trump, as president of the United States, refuses to abide by judicial orders? I mean, it's basically, it would be a breakdown of the American constitutional system. So it's certainly a very dangerous time internally. In other words, you have a very disorganized, sometimes incompetent administration that just is sort of wandering around in all these random directions, taking a lot of policy implementations that are harmful for the United States and certainly for the rest of the world, and following through on them in a way that really circumvents the American legal system. I mean, take, for example, the tariff policy with Canada and Mexico. When Donald Trump came into office the first time, he demanded to renegotiate the NAFTA agreement, the free trade agreement with Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So Canada, Mexico, and the United States agreed to those changes implemented by Donald Trump. And now when Donald Trump has come in a second time, he's completely ignored all those previous agreements. In other words, it's difficult to work with a country that simply ignores all of its promises, ignores all of its agreements, and does whatever it wants on any policy that comes along. And that's true domestically, but it's also true internationally. So, I mean, it's certainly a very difficult time for the world and for the United States. And, certainly, I mean, a lot of Americans are very concerned over these things. I think it seems to me there's a good possibility what may happen is the backlash of these policies, these economic policies, may be very severe on the American economy. And that may cause, really the destruction of Trump's political support. I mean, one analogy, and this is really not directly related to what we've been talking about, but look at, for example, the focus on cryptocurrencies, bitcoins, meme coins. I mean, Donald Trump, what he basically did was implement a meme coin for himself, where he potentially made hundreds of millions or billions of dollars by getting people to buy these worthless currencies. I mean, it's just bizarre. I mean, if somebody would have told any rational person 10 or 20 years ago that so much of the American financial system right now would be wrapped around basically what amounts to a Ponzi scheme. I mean, cryptocurrency is basically a Ponzi scheme. And, to have an American economic system based on a Ponzi scheme is a very, very dangerous, disastrous policy to follow. And, for example, as far as I know, I think a number of years ago, China, for example, banned cryptocurrencies. And, a lot of very rational American economic figures have said the same thing. I mean, basically, Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme. And, it's just bizarre to have the president of the United States supporting something like that. So I think, at some point, I think the markets may, react so negatively against these irrational American economic policies. The economic backlash may force Trump to change his ways, but, I just don't know exactly when that will happen.
I have some points to say that.
Okay.
I think that it's Robert Kagan in the year maybe 2021 or yeah, I think 2021 in Washington Post, he predict that the United States maybe have a constitutional crisis uh, if Trump rejoined these elections in year 2024. And nowadays, the Trump got to the office, just like Ronald said that maybe nowadays United States not facing a constitutional crisis, but it's a crisis of governance. Because in the very famous movie, The Cat House, it said that disorganized labor. Nowadays in the United States, we have a disorganized federal government. That's the most ridiculous part. I have to use these terms because what Trump doing, in my point of views, is making very leading a very dangerous futures. We know that U.S. is a federal state. The federal government and the state government, they have a very complicated and sophisticated power systems to ensure that on one side, the state have enough powers to balance the federal powers. On the other side, the federal powers have enough reputation and authorities to ensure that the different states of the United States can act as a single states in the world. But nowadays, what Trump did, his policy is very seriously damage the federal government's capacities to make a balance with the state powers in certain ways. And the other side, those US federal policies deliver just, Ms. Ronald said very important, he just bypassed the Congress, used so-called executive orders or some kind of statements. Those statements did not have a very clear legal positions in the US law systems to deliver his orders and ask those departments to do everything according to those changing minds of Trump's. And his administration teams is composed by those very loyalty persons represented by the new FBI director, which the most famous for his novels in the name of Saving the Trump King, writing for the children. Now, the point is the Trump is destroying the federal power systems without a very clear understanding how serious the final result be. Just I agree with Ronald that maybe I just read an article this morning. They say that those CEOs or the economic elites, they are not there to challenge Trump's powers. They just wait and see and wish that the market can providing a strong enough negative feedback to Trump policies. For example, that Dow Jones will fall to 20%. Maybe well, it's a great shock to the White House say that, hey, you guys, you need to wake up from your dreams and everything that and think about this countries and the world is wrong and you need to change your policies. But how about the fact if Trump just refuse to accept it? Because according to the personalities for those people maybe have enough capacities to affect Trump, represented by Elon Musk or the JD Vance. These guys, they have a very special personalities. If they face a negative fact, the first choice of their reaction, they will reject to recognize the objectiveness. They will keep their ideas. They will believe that to prove their right is more important than everything else. that incoming scenarios make me worry a lot. That means the world will facing a huge crisis potentially because no matter how we unlikely the Trump's policies, the real fact is United States its own economic and financial stabilities has very strong effect to the whole world systems. And other countries need to preparing for these potential negative futures. And I'm quite confused or worried whether we can have enough corporations. And maybe one of the, I think there are two hopes. The first is China will become mature and strong enough when the final crisis comes, China can provide enough certainties and stabilities to the world systems, just like Minister Wang Yi just mentioned in this news press conference of our 两会. And another side is wish maybe in certain aspect, those guys inside the United States can timely have some positive input on these administrations to slow down their speeding toward these horrible futures before it's too late. Wish that will come true and wish that when the final challenge comes, enough countries from outside from the whole world can launch effective corporations. They can join together to countering back such kind of challenges. But are still very worried about these things. Just I think maybe in the coming 3 or 6 months is very important to find out what finally will be.
From my point of view, I mean, a lot of the reason Trump and the people around him have been taking these actions is it's perfectly true that, what you call the establishment or the deep state or sort of the permanent bureaucracy really did try to destroy Trump's administration after he was elected. In other words, you have an outsider being elected in 2016, somebody who was not validated by the party leadership, the Republican Party leadership, the Democratic Party leadership. And there really was a sense that they couldn't allow him to succeed. And so, for example, with Russiagate and with some of those policies, I mean, what the FBI, with some of these, domestic organizations did to try to cripple the Republican presidency, cripple Trump's presidency, was very wrong and very improper. The problem is, it's a question of like action and reaction. Because of these illegal actions that were taken against Trump in his first term, he decided to basically come in with his second term, surprisingly being reelected, and really destroy all power centers in DC that were not under his total control, which is a very dangerous step to take in terms of the American constitutional system. So, again, allowing, for example, Elon Musk's DOGE to come in and just massively fire numbers of civil servants to sort of take over the bureaucracy. I mean, it's just something that's never happened before in American society. And really, a lot of it is very doubtfully legal. I mean, one analogy I really sometimes thought about, and, I'm not sure whether you would see the same thing, is when you have all of these 20-year-olds or 25-year-olds coming in and basically taking over government departments, on behalf of the national leader and trying to destroy all these other centers of power. A massive attack against the state bureaucracy, the state establishment, by young, sort of fervent individuals on behalf of the national leader. And, that has potentially very dangerous consequences in the United States. And I mean, some of the things, I mean, a lot of these, for example, a lot of these government bureaucracies are very inefficient. They waste a huge amount of money and everything like that. So, I mean, certainly they could be cut. But I mean, the way they're being proposed cut right now is really not at all legal. In other words, Congress basically allocates money in the United States. That's their power, the power of the purse. And to have, for example, the president simply authorize a non-government official like Elon Musk to come in with, teams of people and just sort of take control of all these government departments, I mean, is just a very dangerous precedent for the future. I mean, the other thing about it is a huge fraction of American government spending that's at all discretionary is in the military. It's in the Pentagon. And America spends almost half of the world's entire military budget. And so if Trump and the people around him are not willing to cut the very inefficient military spending we have, it means they're not serious on the issue. In other words, cutting some of these other programs like USAID, I mean, it may or may not be a good thing, but the dollars involved are trivial compared to, for example, the money going to the Pentagon. And I mean, that's really what they should be focusing on. I mean, to take, for example, I mean, again, America spends such a gigantic amount of money on its military, and it doesn't really get much bang for the buck. I mean, the fact that we were not able to produce artillery shells for the Ukraine war when we're spending nearly $1 trillion a year on the Pentagon is just, completely outrageous. So, I mean, it's really a problem. One of the issues is that when administrations are out of power, groups of individuals develop ideological frameworks that, they believe the world is this way, and sometimes they correspond to reality and sometimes they don't. And then with Trump, he basically is allowing these people to implement these policies, many of which are just entirely irrational. So, it's not clear what, will end up happening. I mean, with the American government. I mean, when you suddenly come in, fire enormous numbers of government officials, regardless of their quality of the work, regardless of what they've done, regardless of whether they're competent or not, I mean, you really have potentially a very negative impact on the functioning of the American government. What's happening is basically you have a very sharp division of opinion. You have basically roughly half of the American public that strongly supported Donald Trump because they, hated the people he was opposed to. And you have about half of the American public on the other side. And so, the question is, if these policies, the DOGE policies and the other things like that, have positive effects on the American government, on American spending, on American taxes, then, people will be satisfied with it. But I just am very skeptical of these sorts of sweeping blanket policies implemented by basically a handful of, young activists having more positive than negative effects. I mean, it's just bizarre the things going on. I mean, they've never happened before, in many, many decades in the United States. And it's just, if it were clear that America were run by very smart, very competent people who knew what they were doing, then under those circumstances, if they took steps that basically might even be considered extra legal, there might be some justification to it. There might be some benefits from it. But I mean, I just haven't seen any sign that most of these people know what they're doing. They're just sort of going in and doing things in a very haphazard and random fashion. So I just am very doubtful that the results will be positive. And, again, when the negative results occur, obviously, the government of the United States and Donald Trump will be blamed for them.
Nowadays, or either Trump or Elon Musk, the issue they do is highly disorganized. Mainly, they just doing everything according to their own understanding. And just Ms. Reynolds mentioned very important. All these guys, including Trump, including Elon Musk, they just believe they understand everything, but de facto they understand nothing. And they are so confident and they have so emotionally to doing the things, then finally it will transfer the so-called organized political movement into a completely disorganized mess. First, in the United States, when we're talking about the deep state, frankly speaking, that's the US government officials in these bureaucracies make standing government institutions. Without these standing guys, you cannot have a government. Of course, there are low efficiencies. There's a lot of problems. You need to do it very carefully and sophisticatedly rather than just cut this off, cut that off, like a political campaign. Let's take example that the latest conflict between Elon Musk and Mark Rubio on the Department of State. Before Rubio became the new state of secretaries, he can support Elon Musk to challenge the so-called deep state inside the state bureaucracy systems, which means they are not my guys. And your challenges, you're calling for a radical reforms of these bureaucracy systems will providing me advantages when I enter this department. I have the opportunities to reorganize it, and you will helping me to countering those traditional bureaucracies and make them more easy to avoid my new orders. But when Mark Rubio got his office and Elon Musk want to continue his radical reforms, then the conflict emerged. Who is the real leaders of this department? If the Mark Rubio is the leaders, he will not allow that Elon Musk become the new orders, become the man can deliver the orders to the Department of State employees bypassing Mark Rubio's agreement. That means this internal power conflict break out inside Trump's teams. But to Elon Musk launched this movement, have his own ideas and his own requirement. It's very clear he has at least three goals. The first, he wants to deregulations for his own companies. He has a very personal own interest to push forward the deregulation process selectively, which will make his own companies got the most part of these benefits during that process. And the second, Elon Musk has his own ideas how United States should be governed. He belonged to the groups, which means the cynical right wings. These guys, their real idea is in anarchy world, which means they did not believe any authorities or any kind of the governments. They believe that they are the only supermans has enough intelligence to governance the normal peoples, not only inside the United States, but maybe also maybe the world. And the federal government is nothing more than a kind of agent. And these guys will stand beside and use the very advanced, sophisticated tools, machines represented by the artificial intelligence to governance those stupid mass peoples. These are completely different story or scenarios comparing to the way that the United States nowadays is de facto running. To launch that dreams, Elon Musk need to do one thing. That means completely destroy the reputation of federal government of the United States inside the US normal peoples. So that's what we see that the DOGE department did during the process. They use a very defaming ways. They just launch fragmented informations and use these informations to defaming the federal governments, make people believe all those guys, they just waste the tax and doing this thing stupid, or they just become more very corrupted and put this tax into their own pocket. That means that destroy the confidence and the reputations of the US federal government. Number three, Elon Musk, he did not really understand and he didn't care too much about the so-called US hegemony running in the world. From China's side, he's cutting off of USAID and just these few days, Trump said that I will close down the VOA and the Radio Free Asia. It's a very, how to say, we cannot make any comment. Those institutions is one of the most important tools that help United States winning the Cold War or during the political pressures to countries like China in the several decades. And nowadays, United States federal government say that these institutions that waste money and doing something stupid, I will close them by myself. No more classic self-defeating actions and policies. Frankly speaking, from China's side, we believe that it's a good thing. It will decrease those stupid disinformation and misinformation from that institutions. But we are also very worried. Such kind of radical change of US institutions, can they be stable? Which means till now, Trump is all still the president, not the really king, which means he had only 4 years in the terms. What will happen after that 4 years? Will the United States change back again? Not maybe the new terms of the new admins is the United States is back again, not great again, back again, and then change everything. Trump changed in the just opposite directions. This like United States just running this way and change that ways. Such kind of radical change of the United States to China's side is not a very good signals because we just don't know what will happen. Too much uncertainties. Those uncertainties in this anarchy world is the most negative effects of those elements that we want to face in dealing with this very complicated diplomatic and foreign relations. But in the short terms, I think, I mean, in the coming years, inside Trump's teams, I just worry that the sustainability and to which extent the U.S. domestic political stables can be kept, because during that radical change provided by the DOGE department and the Trump administrations inside the United States, the U.S. domestic conflicts, those tensions may be rising by some, how to say, extraordinary elements like the sudden shutdown of those stock markets or something else, whether we will have a large-scale crisis inside the United States, not only a governance crisis, but a kind of political crisis with the potential that large-scale conflict will break out inside the United States, make countries like China worried very much. I think all the world, no matter what kind of different interest we have, we wish that the great powers can be kept stable domestically. Such kind of stability is very important to the stability of the world systems, especially to keep the peace of the world systems. So that development really make people feel uncomfortable and a little bit nervous to preparing for any potential crisis which were triggered by the US domestic element, which is out of control by anyone. No one can predict what will happen next. No one can predict, no one can affect those crazy guys represented by Elon Musk or Trump. When they wake up in the day, say that I will do this, I have a good idea. Make this. The world just feel crazy.
I very strongly agree with that. I mean, the whole thing is people have to really realize that America, traditionally, ordinary Americans have become more and more prosperous every generation for hundreds of years. I mean, because of America's natural resources, its isolation from other countries. I mean, basically, America underwent a tremendous rise in the prosperity of the ordinary people for generations. And then about 30 or 40 years ago, it stopped dead. In other words, Americans these days are basically becoming more and more poor, more and more miserable, more and more dissatisfied. And, things like that sometimes reach a breaking point. I mean, the whole reason Donald Trump was elected, we're talking about somebody with no political experience, who was massively outspent by the other side in 2016, where all the media organs were against him. Most of the large portion of the Republican Party was against him. The reason people voted for them was that people were so tremendously dissatisfied with the ruling elites, with the establishment of the United States. And that's also the reason that Trump was now reelected. I mean, there was a sense that the government, the establishment is completely opposed to the well-being of the ordinary people. And, when that sort of thing goes on for year after year, it really can cause a destabilization of society with tremendously potential explosive consequences. So, again, I really think, I mean, Trump right now, with many of the steps he's taking, if these policies that he's implementing, I think most economists would agree, have a very negative economic impact on ordinary well-being, a fall in the stock market, rise in unemployment, all of those sorts of factors. I think there could be a tremendous popular backlash against all of our ruling American political elites. I mean, I really think America is in a very politically fragile position right now, which is obviously dangerous for the rest of the world. I mean, when you have, basically irrational, incompetent American leaders, behaving in a very bizarre and disorganized way, taking policy steps that don't necessarily make any sense, and with the people getting more and more dissatisfied, I mean, the result could, potentially be an explosion of some sort. And, it's difficult to say what form that explosion would take. But I think, the American government and the American leadership and Donald Trump are really playing with fire on a lot of these issues. So it's certainly a dangerous time for the United States. And because the US is a very large and important country, it's a dangerous time for the rest of the world as well.
I think this discussion very helpful, and we need more discussions, especially by United States between United States and China. And the scholar nowadays that we have our special duties that we need to input more rationalities and more certainties, and so that we can keep a kind of guardrails in certain aspect, at least the guardrails in the intelligence aspect, so that we can ensure that even though we cannot stop those crazy policies inside the United States, we can provide a proper framework to understand it so that to diminish the potential negative effect to our bilateral relationship as much as possible.
I would certainly agree with that. And I mean, the whole thing is America certainly has many competent, rational people who would be able to do a very effective job of, running parts of our government or running some of these policies, but they're not the individuals who have their hands on power right now. And, in many cases, because they're sort of honest and candid, they're the sort of people who will never get remotely close to power, which is a huge problem for the United States. I mean, we're not a meritocracy. And, sometimes at some point when you pick your political leaders in a very irrational and disorganized way, at some point, the negative consequences end up becoming so overwhelming that they can damage your societies very severely.